Imagine, if you will, taking an X-ray of human morality.
Oh, that sounds messy.
Right, because usually when we talk about a physical medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision, like engineering. To
Exactly.
break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is, broken.
Right. The physical world is binary in that way. It's comforting because we crave visibility and absolute certainty.
Yeah, but the second you step into the world of philosophy or theology or social morality, that X-ray machine suddenly seems completely useless.
Oh, completely.
We look at the landscape of human behavior, and it is incredibly murky. I mean, we throw around words like wisdom,
Hmm.
and instantly our brains conjure up this image of a guy with a long white beard.
Sitting on a misty mountain somewhere.
Exactly. Speaking in abstract riddles that don't actually apply to the reality of, paying rent or navigating a society.
It is the absolute definition of muddy waters. We have this terrible habit of stripping philosophical and religious concepts of their practical mechanics, and we just turn them into abstract poetry.
Yeah,
They sound beautiful, sure, but they don't do any heavy lifting in the real world.
exactly. And that murky definition is exactly what we are going to dismantle today.
I am very excited for this one.
So for this deep dive, you and I are digging into a really fascinating lecture series. The source material is a profound analysis of the Quran, specifically Surah 17, known as Bani Israel.
Right, and we're focusing heavily on ayats 39 to 41 today.
Yes, and the author of this lecture, Ghulam Ahmed Parwez, essentially takes an X-ray machine of pure, unadulterated logic and points it directly at our modern, hazy definition of wisdom.
What makes this specific analysis so compelling is that Parwez, he doesn't just stop at redefining wisdom.
No, he goes much further.
He uses that redefined logic to unpack a massive sociological concept called intellectual shirk, which in this context translates to associating partners with divine law. So the mission today is to explore how this text attempts to anchor human society not with mystical feel-good riddles, but with systemic, inescapable logic.
So to get us started, I want to look at a paradox that kicks off this whole discussion in the source material because, honestly, it really threw me for a loop.
Okay, lay it out.
The text we're analyzing presents a list of very grounded, highly specific social and economic rules. We're talking about things like paying your debts, engaging in honest trade,
Taking care of orphans.
right, taking care of orphans, and not blindly following rumors.
So very foundational, everyday civic actions.
Right, basic stuff. But then the text elevates these ground-level rules by officially labeling them Hikmah, deep wisdom.
Yeah, which is a massive linguistic upgrade.
It fundamentally breaks my brain's assumption about what wisdom is. I mean,
Right.
why is paying your debts or being honest in trade considered deep wisdom rather than just, good manners or a basic civic duty?
That paradox is the perfect entry point for us. To answer that, we really have to look at a stark line the author draws right out at the gate. He sets up this massive dichotomy between two distinct concepts, religion on one side and Deen on the other.
And he is very, very specific about how he defines those two words for the purpose of his analysis, isn't he?
Extremely specific. In the context of this lecture, Parwez presents religion as a system that relies on blind rituals and self-deception.
Like a comfort blanket.
Exactly. It's an abstract comfort blanket. You perform a ritual, you feel good, you go home. But Deen, which the author argues is the actual intended framework of the Quran, is entirely different.
How so?
Deen is a practical, logical system designed to produce concrete, measurable results in the real physical world. To this text, wisdom isn't an abstract philosophy you ponder while staring at the stars.
Right.
Wisdom is the absolute logic of cause and effect.
So it's essentially social physics.
Oh, that is a phenomenal way to phrase it. It is literally the physics of human society.
Wow.
Think about it. If you drop an apple, the law of gravity dictates it falls. If you implement these specific social rules, the law of human interaction dictates your society thrives.
And if you ignore them,
Your society collapses. The rules aren't arbitrary loyalty tests. They are the physical limits of human sociology. Recognizing and operating within those limits, well, that is the wisdom.
but before we can really grasp the grand cosmic logic of this wisdom, we need to see this social physics in action, right? We need to look at the gears of the machine the author is describing.
Absolutely. We have to examine those ground level rules to understand how they actually generate that societal balance. The source categorizes this machinery under a very specific term, the system of Rubiya.
Okay, let's unpack that term for the listener. What exactly is Rubiya?
Broadly translated, rubiya means nourishment, sustenance, or balance, but it implies a very active, continuous process.
Like developing something.
Yes, developing something from its inception to its absolute highest potential. It's not just giving someone a piece of bread so they don't starve.
Right, it's bigger than that.
It's providing the exact conditions necessary for them to flourish. And the first gear in the system, according to the text, starts incredibly close to home.
Right, it starts with the elderly, specifically parents. But I want to pause here because the text doesn't just offer a generic, be nice to your mom and dad.
No, it zones in on a very specific stage of life.
It addresses the exact moment when aging parents are losing their physical and mental faculties. It targets that vulnerability stage when their independence is fundamentally weakening.
And the mandate the text provides is striking. It says you must not rebuke them, and instead you are instructed to speak to them softly, to be cheerful.
And to actively step in and fill the gap of their lost independence.
Exactly. If we look closely at the mechanics of this, there's a profound psychological component happening here.
Yes. That's what stood out to me in the source. It isn't just about the physical provision of food or a warm bed. It's about protecting human dignity.
100%.
Think about what it means to be a fully self-sufficient adult, someone who raised children, who ran a household or a business, and then one day your body or your mind starts to betray you.
It's devastating.
You realize you are entirely dependent on the people you used to care for. That realization has to be absolutely terrifying and, honestly, humiliating.
It is a massive disruption to a person's psychological equilibrium.
And so, by speaking to them cheerfully, by deliberately suppressing any frustration you might feel when they repeat a question for the 10th time or drop a plate, you are acting as an emotional shock absorber.
Right.
You are actively maintaining their internal equilibrium so they don't feel the crushing weight of their own decline.
And this brings us right back to the definition of rubiya. You are nourishing the weakest link in your immediate circle. You are artificially sustaining the balance of the home.
Wow.
But the genius of the system, according to Parwez, is that it doesn't stop at the front door of your house.
It's like a stone dropped in a pond, the expanding circle.
Exactly. The text meticulously pushes this duty of care outward. It starts with the parents. Once that unit is secure, it expands to relatives.
Yeah.
Once the relatives are secure, it expands to neighbors. And the source explicitly notes that the Quran categorizes neighbors into different types. The neighbor who is related to you, and the neighbor who is a complete stranger.
Which creates these overlapping, localized units of stability.
Precisely. You aren't being asked to carry the burden of saving the entire world all at once, which, let's be real, is what usually leads to compassion fatigue.
Oh, absolutely.
You are only being asked to stabilize your immediate radius. But mathematically, if every single person stabilizes their own localized radius, those units eventually interlock.
They form a woven fabric of stability that ultimately covers all of humanity.
Exactly.
I want to look at how that woven fabric actually functions in reality, because the source shares a historical anecdote that perfectly illustrates this interlocking system. It's about the Arab village concept of the hujra.
The community guest room. This is one of the most brilliant historical lenses in the lecture.
It's fascinating. So put yourself in this scenario. Imagine you are a traveler centuries ago. The text refers to this traveler as Ibn Sabil, someone whose journey has cut them off from their normal resources.
Right.
You're on the road, out in the harsh elements, your supplies are dwindling, and you arrive at a random Arab village unannounced. You don't know a single soul. You have no money, no reservation, no connections.
In almost any modern context, you would be in a deeply precarious, if not life-threatening situation.
You'd be sleeping on a park bench hoping you don't freeze.
Literally.
But in this specific society operating under the system of rububiyah, the village had a dedicated collective space, a hujra built specifically for this exact scenario. The traveler can simply walk in.
And notice the mechanics of what happens next, or rather, what doesn't happen.
Right. The traveler doesn't have to knock on random doors and plead for help. They don't have to explain their tragic backstory or prove that they're sufficiently worthy of charity.
They are just seamlessly absorbed by the village.
The source points out how frictionless this process was. Food would just arrive. A young man from the village might bring a dish prepared by one of the households, and everyone currently in the hujra would just sit down and eat together.
Blankets and provisions for the cold were already stocked.
Yeah, the travelers would sleep, wake up in the morning, exchange basic pleasantries, and continue on their way.
Okay, but I have to push back here for a second.
Oh.
Yeah, when I read this, my modern, cynical brain immediately flared up. How does a system like that not get instantly exploited? I mean, human nature is messy.
That's a fair point.
If you have a room with free food and free beds and no one asking questions, how did they afford this and why didn't people just move in permanently?
It's a very valid modern skepticism,
Yeah.
but we have to view the Hujra not as an isolated charity program, but as one gear in a massive interconnected economic machine.
Okay, explain that.
The village wasn't relying on one wealthy philanthropist to fund the room. It was collective pooling. Every household contributed a microfraction of their surplus.
Ah, I see.
When the burden of care is dispersed across 50 or 100 households, the economic impact on any single family is practically negligible.
So it's decentralized welfare.
Exactly. And regarding exploitation, the system works because of the interlocking circles we discussed earlier. The traveler, the Ibn Sabul, is experiencing a temporary loss of balance because they are away from their own resources.
Right. They aren't inherently poor, just displaced.
Exactly. The community steps in to restore that balance. But remember, the traveler themselves comes from a different community that operates by the exact same rules.
Oh, wow. So they aren't a permanent underclass. They are just currently in transit.
Yes. The psychological safety net is profound, but it only functions because the broader economic engines of the society are running honestly.
Which perfectly bridges us to the next set of rules the source covers. Because to maintain a hujra, a society needs resources.
Lots of them.
And to have resources, you need a functional, thriving economy. And the text has a whole section detailing the economic and social ethics required to keep that engine running.
And these rules are just as uncompromising as the rules regarding the elderly.
Absolutely.
One that stood out immediately was a rule regarding poverty and children. The text says, do not kill your children out of fear of poverty.
Right.
Now, historically, that might have referred to literal infanticide during desperate famines. But the author, Parwez, interprets this through a much broader systemic lens, doesn't he?
Yes, he looks at the sociological consequence. He argues that in a modern context, killing a child doesn't just mean physical violence.
What does it mean then?
It means failing to educate them. It means failing to properly nurture their physical, mental, and moral development because the society claims it doesn't have the funds.
Wow. So denying a child their intellectual potential is, in this systemic view, a form of societal murder.
Exactly. You are killing their future contribution. You are extinguishing a mind that could have solved a problem or generated resources for the whole community.
And when a society systematically underfunds the development of its youth out of an artificial fear of poverty, it is basically cannibalizing its own future.
It's an incredibly short-sighted economic policy that directly violates the core principle of rububiyah, which, again, is development to the highest potential.
The text also mandates the absolute protection of orphans, specifically guarding their property and inheritance until they come of age.
Right.
And then it moves to the marketplace, maintaining completely honest weights and measures in all business dealings.
Which is the absolute bedrock of economic trust. I mean, think about the mechanics of a transaction. If you go to a market and you know that the merchant's scale is rigged, what happens?
You get paranoid. You start second-guessing every single purchase.
Exactly. Paranoia infects the entire market. If weights and measures are corrupt, every transaction requires immense amounts of wasted energy to verify.
Buyers stop trusting sellers.
Trade slows down, capital freezes, and the economy collapses. Honest weights aren't just about personal morality, they're the literal lubrication that keeps the economic engine turning.
And speaking of verification, the text applies that exact same standard of proof to social interactions. There is a huge emphasis on not following rumors blindly.
Right, no gossip.
The text demands that you use your own intellect, your own eyes, your own ears, to verify the truth before you act or speak.
It's an epistemological rule placed right alongside the economic ones. Just as you must weigh grain honestly, you must weigh information honestly.
Because if a society operates on unverified rumors and gossip, you get social panic. You get unjust conflicts.
You destroy the trust required to maintain things like the hujra or the marketplace.
And finally, the text offers a behavioral rule to cap it all off. Do not walk with arrogance on the earth.
I love the analogy the author pulls from the text for this. He compares a human being to a fruit-bearing tree.
Oh, it's beautiful.
It really is. The more productive you are, the more wealth, knowledge, or power you accumulate, the more you should physically and metaphorically bow in humility.
So the sheer weight of your contribution to society should make you grounded and accessible, not arrogant and aloof.
Exactly. When you look at all these rules together, protecting the vulnerable, pooling resources, developing the youth, enforcing absolute market honesty, verifying information, and demanding humility from the successful,
Yeah.
you aren't just looking at a list of good deeds, you are looking at a complete sociological framework.
But, okay, let me stop you right there. I hear the term sociological framework, but I also have to represent the listener who might be a bit skeptical here.
Go for it.
Because I'll admit, I was skeptical. I read this and thought, well, these are great civic duties. If I pay my taxes, if I don't cheat my customers, if I take care of my aging mother, sure, I'm a good citizen.
Right.
But the author claims this creates a society with zero friction. Zero. That sounds like a utopian fantasy.
I like that.
Human beings are inherently flawed. Does the author seriously claim that following a few civic rules eliminates all societal friction?
It's a crucial pushback. When the author talks about reducing friction to zero, we really need to understand it in the context of physical laws. Think of it like thermodynamics.
Okay, thermodynamics.
In the physical world, an engine with absolutely zero friction is a theoretical ideal. But the closer you engineer your machine to that ideal, the more power it produces and the longer it lasts.
Oh, it's an asymptotic goal. You get closer and closer.
Exactly. The author is arguing that these rules are the only engineering principles that actively reduce social friction. When these specific rules are followed as a cohesive system, society trends toward equilibrium.
Give me an example.
Well, if orphans are always protected, you never generate a desperate, disenfranchised underclass that eventually resorts to crime just to survive.
Oh, I see.
If rumors are strictly verified, you drastically reduce the friction of civil lawsuits and communal violence.
So the friction isn't eliminated magically, it's prevented structurally.
Precisely. When these rules are ignored, you guarantee social friction. You guarantee theft, societal decay, and eventual collapse.
Right.
Therefore, calling these rules hikmah, or deep wisdom, is an acknowledgement that adhering to the objective cause and effect laws of the universe is the only truly wise way to build a civilization.
Okay, that makes sense. We are establishing that true wisdom requires a structural understanding of cause and effect. And that brings us to the most intense, uncompromising part of the source material.
Yes, it does.
We need to return to that dichotomy the author set up at the very beginning, Deen versus religion, because the author uses this logic of cause and effect to absolutely dismantle what we traditionally view as religious practice.
This is where Parwez gets fiercely critical, and he lays down a really radical claim. True wisdom, within the system of Deen, is based entirely on reason and expected results.
Meaning, it has to work here, right now, in this life.
Yes. The author argues that if you are truly following God's law, you must see a positive, tangible result in this exact physical world, not just a vague promise of a reward in the afterlife.
Right.
If the law is genuinely divine, its implementation must yield dominance, dignity, and peace in your current living society.
And this is where he severely critiques blind ritualistic religion as a form of mass self-deception. To explain this, he uses two incredibly sharp, undeniable analogies. Let's look at the farming analogy first.
The seed analogy is a brilliant distillation of the cause and effect test.
So imagine you are a farmer. Your survival depends on your crop. You go out to your field, you plant a specific type of seed, you water it, you weed it, you put in all the physical labor.
Hard work.
Exactly. But at the end of the season, nothing grows. The yield is absolute zero. The question the author asks is, the following spring, do you confidently plant that exact same bad seed using the exact same methods and tell yourself you're going to get a massive harvest?
If you do, you're going to starve. A rational person changes the seed or changes the soil. The failure of the crop is objective proof that the input was flawed.
Right. And then he uses a medical analogy. Let's say I have a terrible disease. I go to a doctor, and the doctor prescribes a specific medicine. I take it diligently every single day. But weeks go by, and I am not cured. In fact, my symptoms might be getting worse. Do I just keep taking that exact same medicine, patting myself on the back, assuming I am cured just because I went through the physical motion of swallowing a pill?
Of course not. You demand a different treatment because in medicine, just like in agriculture, the result dictates the value of the action.
Exactly.
The ritual of swallowing the pill is meaningless if the biological reality of the disease remains unchanged.
But the author points out that when it comes to theology and religion, humanity completely abandons this basic survival-level logic. He uses the specific example of salat or prayer.
And he really doesn't pull any punches here.
Not at all. He observes that people perform these religious rituals continuously Day after day, year after year, they meticulously follow all the physical movements, the bowing, the reciting, the standing.
Right.
But, and this is a massive earth-shattering but, for the listener to consider if their character doesn't fundamentally change as a result of that ritual.
If the prayer doesn't actively protect them from stinginess or selfishness or unethical behavior in the marketplace,
Then, according to the physics of Deen, their prayer is completely void. It is a mathematical zero.
the result wasn't achieved, the medicine didn't cure the disease of arrogance or greed, therefore the ritual was functionally meaningless.
But what does religion do? Religion steps in and whispers to the practitioner, don't worry. Your character is still terrible. You still cheat your neighbors and you're still stingy with your wealth.
Right, but you did the ritual.
Exactly. But because you perform the physical acrobatics of the ritual, you get spiritual points. You are saved in the afterlife. Parwez calls this pure, unadulterated self-deception.
It is a profound critique of spiritual complacency. What the text is arguing is that divine laws are not arbitrary loyalty tests designed to see if you'll just jump through hoops.
The blueprints.
Exactly, they are functional blueprints for human flourishing. If you build a bridge using a set of blueprints, and the bridge immediately collapses when a car drives on it, you don't stand in the rubble and say, well, I follow the blueprint, so it's a perfectly good bridge.
You'd sound insane.
Right. The collapse is the objective proof that something was fundamentally wrong with either the blueprint or your execution of it.
And what I appreciate about this source is its absolute impartiality. It is fiercely objective. It argues that if your supposed religious system isn't bringing your society actual dominance, actual dignity, and actual economic and social peace right now in the physical world, then you are not actually following the true logic of the Quran.
It's a harsh truth.
It doesn't matter how many rituals you perform, how long your beard is, or how loudly you chant. If the social friction is still there, if your society is corrupt, poor, and chaotic, you are failing the test of cause and effect. Your seed has failed to yield a crop.
But this raises a really important psychological question.
What's that?
If this logic of cause and effect is so clear, if the physics of society are as undeniable as a failing crop or a collapsing bridge, why is it so incredibly hard for humanity to grasp?
That is the million-dollar question.
Why do we constantly retreat into the comfortable self-deception of empty rituals instead of doing the hard work of building a functional society?
That is the exact question that transitions us into the linguistic deep dive of the source material. Because the text isn't just a rule book, it's a pedagogical tool designed to break through human stubbornness.
And humanity is deeply, inherently stubborn.
Oh, we love our comfort zones. We love the illusion of the medicine over the bitter reality of the cure.
So how does the Quran structurally attempt to bypass that stubbornness?
Well, the author brings up Ayat 41 to explain this. The verse reads, "We have explained things in various ways in this Quran, so that they may take heed." And here, the source introduces a fascinating Arabic concept called Tasreef-ul-Ayaat.
Tasreef-ul-Ayaat. This is essentially the central engine of the Quran's teaching methodology. To translate it mechanically, it means explaining a single, unified concept by turning it over and presenting it from multiple rotating angles.
The source uses a brilliant way to visualize this, and I want you, the listener, to picture this with me. Think of this core logical truth like a beautifully cut, three-dimensional diamond.
The diamond analogy is perfect for understanding Tasreef.
If you hold a diamond up, but you only ever look at one single flat face of it, you miss the vast complexity of the internal structure. It just looks like a flat, shiny piece of glass.
Right.
Your brain gets used to it, gets bored by it, and stops paying attention. What the text does, what the mechanism of Tasreef is it slowly, deliberately turns the diamond.
It changes the angle of the light.
Exactly. It shows you one face of the law using a historical example of a destroyed city. Then it rotates the diamond and shows you the exact same law using a legal metaphor about contracts.
And then it rotates it again.
Right? It rotates it again and uses a biological analogy about rain and dead earth. It keeps showing you different facets, different linguistic angles of the exact same singular law until your brain finally bypasses its own defensive stubbornness and goes, aha, I see the whole structure now. I see the 3D shape.
The psychological astuteness of this method is remarkable. Parwez highlights that the text relies on what it calls mobin Arabic, meaning clear, expressive, fundamentally clarifying language.
Yeah.
Think about how human beings learn. If a teacher stands at a chalkboard and just repeats the exact same sentence 20 times in a monotone voice, what happens to the student?
The student completely tunes out. The brain's defense mechanisms go up.
Yeah.
Like, I heard you the first time, leave me alone.
Right. We become completely numb to repetition. But Tasreef is designed to sneak past those neurological defenses. It takes the single subject, let's say, the inescapable law of cause and effect we just discussed, and it rotates it.
So you never get bored.
The listener never gets bored, and more importantly, never gets defensive because the narrative scenery is constantly changing. But beneath the surface, they are secretly internalizing the exact same singular truth from every possible direction.
It's a pedagogical system engineered specifically for a human brain that is highly prone to distraction, cognitive dissonance, and ego-driven denial.
It's very clever.
It refuses to let you look away from the truth, but it changes the lens often enough that you don't actually want to look away.
So if that is the theory of how the text teaches, we need to look at how it executes this in practice. We need to look at one of these facets to see how it actively exposes illogical thinking.
Yes, and the source gives us one of the sharpest, most intellectually brutal historical examples of this rotating logic. This brings us to what we can call the engine of reason found in Ayat 40 and the profound concept of gender irony.
This is truly a masterclass in exposing internal hypocrisy.
It really is. So let's set the historical scene so you understand the gravity of this. We are analyzing Ayat 40, which asks a very pointed, almost sarcastic rhetorical question.
What's the verse?
It says, "Has your Lord chosen you for sons and taken for himself daughters from among the angels?"
Now, to a modern reader, that just sounds like a slightly confusing theological question.
Yeah.
But to understand the impact of this verse, you have to understand the specific historical and cultural context of the Arab tribes being directly addressed at the time.
Right. The source details how the societal bias of these specific tribes was so deeply, violently rooted in patriarchy that they viewed having daughters as a mark of extreme, unbearable shame.
It wasn't just a preference for boys, it was a cultural phobia of females.
The text notes that if a man was told his wife had given birth to a daughter, his face would darken with grief, and he would literally hide from his community at a profound humiliation.
Just unbelievable.
And we know that in the most extreme, horrific cases, this shame drove them to bury female infants alive. That is the sheer level of hatred, shame, and societal degradation associated with the female gender in that specific cultural moment.
But, and here's where the text rotates the diamond and springs the trap at the exact same time they were committing these atrocities out of shame, their prevailing theology claims something entirely contradictory.
What was it?
It claimed that the angels, these divine exalted beings of light, were the daughters of God.
The cognitive dissonance is absolutely staggering. When I read this, I actually had to stop and process it. How do you hold those two thoughts in your head?
You really can't, not logically.
Right. And what the author explains is the sheer logical trap the Quran sets here. It doesn't just come out and yell, your theology is bad, or stop burying your daughters.
It uses their own hideous, deeply ingrained bias against them. It's an engine of reason designed to break their brains in the best way possible.
It forces the audience into a corner where they have to confront their own massive internal inconsistency.
Yes. The inescapable logic the text imposes is this. If you find daughters so inherently shameful, so culturally degrading, that your own logic cannot even tolerate their existence in your own home, how does your logic simultaneously assign them to the creator of the universe?
Oh, wow. It is exposing a fatal glitch in their epistemological operating system.
Precisely. You are claiming that God is the supreme, ultimate authority, yet you are attributing to that God something you consider a mark of utter, unforgivable humiliation.
You literally cannot hold both of those beliefs simultaneously without admitting that your internal logic is entirely fractured.
And here is the crucial takeaway for you, the listener, right now. The author makes it very clear that this isn't just a critique of ancient history. We aren't just dunking on 7th century Arab tribes to feel intellectually superior.
No, this is a mirror being held up to the listener today.
The principle of the rotating diamond applies eternally. Human nature hasn't changed.
Exactly. The core lesson of Ayat 40 is about internal consistency. If your logic doesn't hold up in the small, everyday things, if your internal consistency fails in your own house, with your own biases and prejudices, it absolutely will not hold up when dealing with the divine.
Or the structure of society.
Or the complex laws of cause and effect. You cannot have a fractured, hypocritical operating system and expect to build a stable, friction-free society.
Which brings us to the most vital question of the entire deep dive.
Okay, well, let's hear it.
If a society fails this test of internal consistency, if it builds its foundation on a fractured operating system, what actually happens? What is the physical, sociological result when a civilization tries to serve multiple competing logics simultaneously?
That is the big one. That is where all of this culminates. This brings us to Ayat 39 and the grand concept of intellectual shirk. We are moving from the psychology of the individual straight into grand sociological physics.
The text establishes the one authority principle.
Right. Ayat 39 gives this ultimate dire warning against setting up another God alongside the one God. But the source makes a massive, crucial distinction here that redefines everything.
It really does.
It frames this other God not as literal statues of wood or stone that people bow down to. It frames it as intellectual shirk, which means associating partners with divine law.
This is a profound, paradigm-shifting view of idolatry. It's not about primitive people worshiping a golden calf. It's about highly civilized people bowing to conflicting systems of authority.
Exactly. Let's ground this with an analogy before we look at the history. Imagine you're driving a car. The steering wheel is correctly connected to the front tires,
Okay.
but the brake pedal and the gas pedal are somehow remotely connected to a different car entirely, which is being driven by someone else with totally different goals.
Oh, that sounds like a nightmare. You have two completely disconnected centers of authority trying to control the same vehicle.
You are going to crash violently. You cannot function. That is what intellectual shirk is on a societal level. The source gives some incredible historical examples of how civilizations have built this exact kind of crashing car.
Let's hear one.
First, it looks at the concept of the state versus God. The author notes how Europe historically utilized the doctrine of the divine right of kings.
Ah, yes, a fascinating and deeply destructive era of political theology.
They use this doctrine to give the state or the monarch the exact same unquestionable divine authority as God. The king's personal whims, his desire for taxes or war, became indistinguishable from divine law.
Which meant the people were subjected to the arbitrary desires of a flawed human being, but it was disguised as absolute infallible logic.
That is the textbook definition of intellectual shirk. You have set up a competing legal standard that serves the ego of the elite, rather than serving the equilibrium and rubudia of the whole society.
But the author is relentless, and he doesn't just critique external European histories, he turns the exact same unsparing lens inward onto the Muslim world itself.
Yeah, this is where his analysis is particularly uncompromising.
He goes hard. The source heavily critiques the historical practice within the Muslim world of elevating outside traditions, unverified rumors, or secondary historical texts to the exact same authoritative, unquestionable level as the Quran itself.
Essentially creating competing bodies of law within the exact same system.
Right. If you have the clear, objective cause and effect law of the Quran saying one thing like, verify all rumors, but then a society elevates a secondary, historically dubious text to the exact same level of divine authority, and that text says something contradictory.
You have just committed intellectual shirk.
Exactly. You have introduced a competing God into your legal and moral framework. You have connected the gas pedal to a different car. You have intentionally fractured the operating system.
And if we connect this back to the social physics we discussed at the very beginning, we know that actions have inescapable consequences.
Yeah.
So what is the inevitable consequence of a society operating on a fractured system of intellectual shirk?
Well, the source gives us a very specific Arabic term for the final consequence. The text translates the result of this as becoming madmuman makuda.
Rejection and blame. Total destitution.
Exactly.
Can you explain the mechanics of how a society actually reaches the state of madmuman mudra? How does competing logic lead to destitution?
It comes down to the friction we discussed earlier. When a society operates on a single objective law, like honest weights and measures, or protecting the vulnerable energy is conserved and progress is made.
Right, the engine runs smoothly.
But when you have competing legal, moral, or political standards, all of society's energy is consumed by internal conflict. If the rich are judged by one law and the poor by another, you generate immense resentment.
That creates friction.
Exactly. If religious elites claim authority over the intellect of the masses, you stifle scientific and economic innovation. The society tears itself apart from the inside.
You lose your equilibrium completely.
You end up madmuman matura. You are socially defeated, internally conflicted, economically stagnant, and ultimately left behind by the brutal, logical forward march of history.
Wow.
A society with conflicting authorities cannot compete with a society operating on unified, efficient logic.
And this wasn't just some theoretical threat debated in ancient classrooms. The source points out the real-world geopolitical context of this pure, singular logic when it was first introduced to the global stage.
It was introduced into a world dominated by massive, deeply entrenched superpowers.
Yes, the big powers of the era, the Byzantine Roman Empire and the Sassanid Persian Empire. And according to the author's analysis, these massive, heavily armed empires were utterly terrified of this new, seemingly simple system of Deen.
Which begs the question, why? Why would empires with hundreds of thousands of soldiers and massive wealth be scared of an ideology about unified logic and taking care of orphans? Because their entire imperial structures were built purely on intellectual shirk. Their survival depended on it. They relied on conflicting authorities, rigid class systems, the suppression of the masses, and the unquestionable divine rights of their emperors and priests to maintain control.
The system worked because it was unequal.
Exactly. So when a new system emerges that openly declares there is only one logical authority, all human beings are subject to the exact same cause and effect laws, and actual real-world results matter more than your elite rituals, it threatens to completely dissolve the very foundations of their imperial power.
It's an earthquake.
Singular, transparent, objective logic is the ultimate existential threat to any corrupt, multi-tiered system of control. It exposes the rigged scale.
It is the ultimate disruptor. It strips away the mystique of the powerful and subjects them to the exact same physics as the poorest traveler in the Hudra. And wow, that really brings us full circle, doesn't it?
It beautifully connects the micro to the macro.
We started this deep dive looking at a list of seemingly simple, mundane civic duties, speaking cheerfully to your aging parents, maintaining honest wheats in the market, pooling resources for the traveler.
The localized micro-level gears of Rububiyya.
And now, looking through the lens of this text, we see exactly how it scales up to the rise and fall of global empires. We learned that true wisdom, Hikmah, isn't mystical poetry. It requires real-world results and an adherence to the physics of cause and effect.
Right.
We saw how the text uses rotational logic, Tasreef, to patiently outsmart our own stubborn human brains. We witnessed the brilliant, brutal logical takedown of societal hypocrisy with the gender irony of Ayat 40.
It's all connected.
And finally, we saw the massive, civilization-destroying danger of conflicting authorities, intellectual shirk, and how it inevitably leads a society to become medboman matura.
It is a breathtakingly cohesive system when viewed through the specific analytical lens. Every single rule serves the ultimate goal of reducing friction and maintaining societal equilibrium.
It really is incredible. And for you listening, I want you to know this is just the beginning of Parwez's exploration of this text. I want to give you a quick teaser for what is coming next in this series.
Oh, the next part is mind-blowing.
In Lecture 9 of 17, which covers Ayats 42 through 52, we're going to zoom out even further. We will literally go from the social laws of an Arab village to the very structure of the universe itself.
Expanding the scope dramatically.
We'll explore how everything in the heavens and earth structurally glorifies this singular law of cause and effect. And we'll dive deep into why human beings find the concept of life after death, which the author interprets as the civilizational rebirth of a dead society, so incredibly hard to mathematically calculate.
We're moving from the physics of human society to the overarching physics of the cosmos. It promises to be a massive shift in perspective.
I cannot wait for that. But before we wrap up today, I want to leave you, the listener, with the final provocative thought, something to really chew on during your commute or while you're walking the dog or doing the dishes.
Leave them with a challenge.
Think back to that opening metaphor about the X-ray machine and the strict, uncompromising demand for consistency.
The demand for a unified operating system.
Look critically at your own life right now. Are you committing your own localized version of intellectual shirk in your daily operating system?
It's a tough question to ask yourself.
Do you hold one standard of strict cause and effect logic for your career and how you manage your money, but a completely different, murky, emotion-based standard of logic for your political views? Do you demand rigorous evidence when making a financial investment, but rely entirely on comfortable self-deception when it comes to your personal morality or how you treat the vulnerable people in your radius?
Are you consciously or unconsciously serving multiple conflicting authorities in your own mind?
If you are, well, ask yourself, honestly, what kind of internal and external friction is that creating in your own world? Are you approaching the state of equilibrium, or are you driving a car with two steering wheels, speeding blindly toward the crash? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of wisdom. Keep questioning those assumptions. Keep turning that diamond to see the new facets, and we will catch you next time.